listening to Transformation in Trials. Welcome to Transformation in Trials. This is a podcast exploring all things transformational in clinical trials. Nothing is off limits on the show, and we will have guests from the whole spectrum of the clinical trials community. And we're your hosts, Ivana and Sam.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the Transformation in Trials podcast. And today we're delighted to be joined by Philip Russmeyer, who is CEO and co-founder of a really exciting technology company called Fitfile. Hi, Philip. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Sam and Ivana. It's great to be here.
Perfect. We're really glad to have you here, Philip, just giving your background and some of the things that you're up to at Fitfile. But like with all of the episodes of Transformation in Trials, we try to factor the episode around a specific topic and theme. And this week's theme is going to be true data anonymization and its promise for transformation in trials and beyond. So hoping to explore topics like that and related to that with you on this episode today, Philip.
Sounds good to me.
Perfect. All right. So to get us started then, in Transformation in Trials, we have a pretty broad church in terms of our listeners to the podcast. So perhaps to set the scene for them about this topic of data anonymization, could you talk to us a little bit about the topic of data anonymization, specifically in the context of clinical research?
Sure. So in the context of clinical research, data anonymization is about how existing and newly created data on identifiable individuals before, during, and after clinical trials can be used safely and scalably to help drive the most effective and efficient research. So obviously for formal RCTs with enrolled trial subjects, there'll be active consenting of those individuals to participate in the study and also to have identifiable data used towards core study purposes. However, there are aspects of clinical research where anonymized data is critically important. For instance, to get data on where to look for study subjects in the first place, or for gathering data on non-trial subjects, or the long-term follow-up initiatives that are increasingly being embraced, or even for the future reuse of research data for a different purpose.
Fascinating stuff, Philip. And how does this topic of anonymization is often grouped in with other related topics like the tokenization, for example? That seems to be one of the buzzwords of the moment when you look at this whole kind of topic on LinkedIn. What are the differences there, and why should we really care about that?
Yeah, tokenization is absolutely being, I think, endorsed increasingly by the life science industry, and I'm really happy to see that. But there is a key difference between tokenization and anonymization. If you look at true anonymization, that will involve the removal of all identifying information from a data set so that individuals can never be re-identified by any means reasonably likely to be used. And by contrast, tokenization, rather than involving the removal, involves the replacement of personal identifiers with an unchanging artificial identifier called a token. And this token is a reference that can be used inside a tokenization system to re-identify individuals. Now, the tokenization as a practice is very helpful to link data across the silos that we see everywhere, right? Both within organizations and across organizations, including often the sponsors themselves behind the research. And it's definitely useful for when re-identification is absolutely a requirement, but it does carry serious downsides. Tokenization, because of its reversibility, does not fully protect people's privacy. And that in turn causes significant worries actually about the secondary use of data, which has held back health research. So there's numerous scholarly articles. There's I think it's a European Journal of Human Genetics in a 2020 article, which cited this as a real problem. And we've also seen it in practice with things like the somewhat ill-fated data sharing initiative in the UK, the GPDPR program, which was trying to make primary care data more widely available for clinical and other research. And that failed as well because people were worried about the usage of this tokenized data. And the third problem with tokenization is that under regulatory environments like the GDPR, it requires consenting or other legal basis, and those can be very slow. They can be complex and costly. And I think it's estimated today that the cost of getting consent from individuals is around $400 per consent. And even then, that consent cannot necessarily be relied upon in future for new purposes or re-identification. And again, there's quite a lot of skepticism therefore today around what might be possible down the line, even if the upfront cost is okay. So we think that the difference between anonymization and tokenization is an important one to consider.
Now, it might just be me, but is there a place for both, or could you go down could there be a world where there is only anonymization? E.g., do you need tokenization and anonymization, or is that a silly question?
No, I think it's a great question, because I think in reality, it depends very much on the use case that you're looking at and the degree to which you may want to have this re-identifiability down the line. So one of the discussions that I've had quite often together with the team is and our customers is to establish down the line the provenance and the lineage of data, and actually also to be able to verify why the data is showing what it's showing. So are there outliers? Are there other statistical attributes that are difficult to look at properly if it's on the pseudonymized or tokenized or anonymized basis? So there are use cases where that re-identifiability is certainly very helpful. I would argue, however, that one of the key restrictions that we've seen historically around anonymization has been that by default, the logic has run that if you anonymize somebody's data in one source, you cannot then unite it across sources. And therefore, one of the biggest needs that bringing those health profiles together is then not properly addressed with anonymization. That's something that, as I'm sure we'll come on to talk about, is now no longer a problem. But historically, that's led people to tokenize rather than anonymize, where they've wanted to look at data across sources.
Understood. Is there some sort of difference between the EU and the US when it comes to the preference for how to deal with data?
I think there is a difference, Ivana, between the kind of attitudes and practices between Europe and the US. In Europe, of course, we are bound by the GDPR, and I think most data privacy experts would agree that the GDPR is about as stringent as any data protection regime in the world. And I think that's driven by Europeans historically being more privacy conscious than is typically the case in the US, where HIPAA and the state laws have thus far been more relaxed than the GDPR when it comes to secondary use of data or even primary use of data for trials and other research. So that's been historically the case. But, I think it's interesting when you look at the trend now in the US, which does look like it's heading in the direction of increased privacy consciousness and protection. And I think we saw last year the introduction of the draft American Data Privacy and Protection Act, I believe it's called the ADPPA, which would actually offer stronger general protection of consumer data privacy and is indeed taking notes from the EU's GDPR. Now, that would apply to health data held by non-HIPAA covered entities. But I think together with some of the state-specific legislation, which of course takes precedence where that goes beyond HIPAA, and we've seen more of that coming through, I think it's indicative of a longer run likely convergence between the US and Europe around stronger privacy protection.
what about some of the stakeholders concerned, Philip? When it comes to data, there are lots of people in play, right? There's the person whose data is being collected. There's the people that stand to benefit from being able to access the data. Maybe there are clinical trial sponsors in play. Maybe there are regulators too. Maybe starting from the person whose data it is, what are some of the considerations that you hear from that group of stakeholders as it relates to data anonymization, and maybe some concerns that they might have?
I think it's been shown quite consistently that when individuals' data is used in sufficiently protected manner to help people like themselves. So if, for example, somebody has a chronic condition or is a cancer sufferer or some other medical condition, there's usually a lot of readiness for that data to be used responsibly in privacy protected form. I think, what we hear, and I think what has been proven out by statistical evidence as well, is that if data is being used by third parties, where it's not clear what those third parties' interests are, and there's no transparency around that, and maybe that sort of that altruistic benefit is not obvious, that's when people really get worried about it, and probably rightly so. I think when you look at the value, I'm told, I don't know this myself, but the value on the dark web of health records is apparently up to 10 times that of financial records, because there is a lot of bad faith activity that can be undertaken with people's sensitive data. I think individuals are right to be concerned about that. Equally, when you look at examples of GDPR breaches, we've seen billions of fines now of companies actually not taking seriously the protection of individuals. So I think, those citizens are right to be concerned about the use of their data if it's not been sufficiently privacy protected at source.
Got it. That kind of leads me to the next point, which you touched upon earlier, around consent. So assuming either approach, there has to be a level of initial consent, right? Or maybe not, to use that data for further use cases in the future. Could you talk a little bit about the consent and what that means for the use of data?
Absolutely. So what you need to have in place for using identifiable data, or under the eyes of a regime like the GDPR, tokenized data, which is still classified as identifiable data because it is reversible and because it's been effectively pseudonymized in a non-random way and a reversible way, is to have a legal basis for using that data. Right. And one of the legal bases that you can create is to get specific individual consent from the individuals concerned to be allowed to use their data. Now, the words here are very important, right? It has to be specific to the purpose that you are intending to use that data for. So you can't just get blanket consent forevermore. And it has to be given effectively quite willingly and openly by the people. Now, with anonymization, actually, again, in an environment like the GDPR, that takes you beyond those requirements. So if you can show that you have irreversibly removed all direct or correctly treated indirect personal identifiers so as to stop the re-identifiability, you actually do not need to get consent from the individuals involved. I think it's an interesting consideration when you look at data controllers and getting their permission to use the data. So I would always counsel people to make absolutely certain that those who are the controllers or the guardians of the data are fully on board with the use of the data and kept informed as well. But if you're using anonymized data, that is more than sufficient And you certainly don't need to go all the way to consent the individuals to whom those now anonymized data related.
Looking from a clinical trial perspective, but also post-marketing data from a life science perspective, where my universe is, there are sometimes cases where we do need to provide services to patients in situations where we are not able to collect their consent. For example, in the case of adverse events, we do need information about the person to be able to follow up and make sure that we provide them with the right guidance and treatment, but where we may not be able to ensure their data privacy entirely. Have you ever encountered those borderline situations where you kind of have to pick between the service and the patient or protecting their actual data?
I think there are certainly scenarios where, for example, safety considerations and in adverse event reporting circumstances, it is possible to use the legitimate patient care basis to communicate with identifiable individuals. So depending on what process has been used to protect their privacy, either then, if that's been tokenization, for example, I would argue that it's fine to reverse that and re-identify, because if you're doing that in that legitimate patient care interest, you're okay to do that. Or solutions also exist. So with Fitfile's platform, for example, if you'd done that on an anonymized basis, you could rerun the query and identify, based on the same query plan, individuals that you do then need to communicate with because of this safety risk that otherwise wouldn't be possible to avoid.
So just to kind of turn this back to a little bit around transformation in trials, because that is the topic of the podcast, of course. Just in my day job, I often see the topic of real world data grouped, and I'm not necessarily grouping this necessarily with that, but I see real world data on fancy PowerPoint slides grouped with GXP data, grouped with operational data, grouped with ontology data, etc. Where does this whole sort of topic of data anonymization, etc., fit within the landscape of clinical trials? And maybe elaborate a bit more on some of the possible use cases.
Sure. So I think we've already established that true anonymization doesn't need to imply any material loss of data utility versus tokenization, for example. What you need to establish first and foremost is that both approaches sufficiently protect privacy. And actually, the best anonymization protocols select the optimal combinations of redactions or restrictions or randomizations or generalizations, which prevent re-identifiability, but still deliver the required insights for the stratified populations of interest. And if that's been done correctly, I think there is probably 4 or 5 really good use cases in clinical research for anonymized data. So a major use case for anonymized data in clinical research is to have access to larger scale and probably more granular data sets to establish and then iterate trial protocol feasibility. So if you look at what continues to be the biggest cost and reason for delays in studies, I think latest evidence still suggests that 80 to 90% of trials have twice the expected recruitment period. You're trying to then really get at that, because the driver behind that, of course, as we all know, is inadequate information during the initial speccing and iterations of that trial protocol. And I think if you can get access to larger volumes and higher quality anonymized data, rather than having to worry about, is this tokenized, have I got consent or whatever, then you can actually have a greater degree of specificity and then greater effectiveness once it comes to the recruitment of individuals that are associated with those initial anonymized estimates. So that's a major use case. I think a second major use case for anonymized data in clinical research is to generate clinically validated and comparable data on non-trial subjects for larger and frankly more ethical synthetic control arms. So to your point about real world data and how can you use that, I think with the advent of new data access and also unification technologies, it's increasingly possible to really expand very significantly the control groups during trials, and that's something that we're very excited about. I think another major usage for anonymized data in clinical research is to power long-term follow-up. So if you look at what can be lined up already, let's say in a phase 2b or a phase 3 trial, is to start collecting this data in a way that then post completion of the trial doesn't risk the privacy or even what we've seen in some cases, opposition to such multi-year data collection, because ideally you keep carrying on, right? For some conditions, 5-10 years is really, really useful. But often, again, people quite rightly say, look, I'm happy to participate in the trial, maybe for 2-3 years, but for you to then want to continue to track me feels very invasive if that sort of carries on forevermore. So that's another major reason for going with anonymization for those long-term follow-up type exercises. And then a little bit to your point about commercial positioning, of course, post-launch, the real-world data on inline product usage and outcomes to zero in on the best responder groups, feedback into product positioning, but also, I would argue, into feedback loops for better R&D programs down the line is a really, really helpful application of truly anonymized data. And then it goes without saying, another use case for anonymized data in clinical research is the possibility to reuse the study data that has been safely anonymized. Because when you look at how many locked trial study data sets exist around the world, it's incredible, right? And the wheel gets reinvented, in my opinion, far too much with people looking at quite similar data subjects and similar data elements, and we're actually reusing particularly some of the non-primary endpoint data or some of the ambient data as well during trials would be so helpful if that could be unlocked at greater scale using anonymization techniques.
That is mind-blowing to me. I have never considered that the reason why we cannot reuse trial data is actually because of the consent of the patients. And if we remove that barrier, we could actually, there are so many questions we could get answered as we go looking at those data sets without recruiting any additional patients.
Yes, and I think if we stick with the beloved GDPR, Articles 6 and 9 cover processing of data for the purposes of anonymization, but actually, I think people, including the European sort of Data Security Protection Board and so forth, are taking a sensible view on anonymizing that data at source to then be allowed to do this, slightly repurposing of data. But of course, one of the things, Ivana, that historically has been a problem, coming back to this point of, okay, that's great, but let's say that study concluded last year, and let's say we actually now want to kind of have a dynamic look, an updated look at what's going on with people, and kind of build on that foundation of data. This is where we come back to the topic of how do we unite that anonymized data with updated data on a comparable basis, and that's where my team has spent all of their time to actually make that possible for the first time.
Yeah, and I think that's a great kind of segue into turning our attention a bit more to yourself, Philip, a bit about your background and what you're currently up to at Fitfile. Perhaps you can give us a quick overview on that topic.
Yeah, I'm no different to anybody else. Always easy to talk about myself, and please stop me as soon as I go on for too long. But look, so I
finishes it in 40 minutes. So.
And you have the editor's privilege. So I started my career in the energy sector, working on corporate strategy at Shell before moving into investment banking and private equity. with quite large corporations like UBS and Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs. And I mentioned that because it was a really great way to get exposure to kind of global dynamics, and particularly during those early years in finance, my love for healthcare and life sciences started to develop. So I worked a lot with pharma clients in Europe and the US, and started to realize the importance of data and how unsophisticated its use has been in the healthcare domain. Unfortunately, now already decades ago. And then after joining the founding team and helping to scale up the now global investment firm Vitruvian Partners, I spent an increasing amount of time on the boards of life science and clinical research oriented leaders like Signant Health, Flex Global, Ada Health out of Berlin, Sciences out of the UK. And this recurring chorus around a critical need to better access and unite health data was, in my ears at least, getting ever stronger from pretty much all of the health system, the life science, and the payer stakeholders that I was interfacing with. So I found myself sort of unable to ignore this. And I founded Fitfile because with the average newly created health data per human on Earth, due to shortly hit an extra, I think it's about 1 gigabyte every year, and 50 to 60% of that accumulating in non-clinical silos around, people's movements, their dietary lifestyle habits, some of their other historical aspects as well, whilst clinical repositories remain equally siloed. The team at Fitfile and our technology is geared towards unlocking the, unfortunately, all too often latent power and value of this data by uniting it across silos. And our aim in that is to make sure that everybody is better informed, that resources are more efficiently allocated, and ultimately health research and outcomes are transformed.
Very noble cause there. And I think that was 4 minutes, 30 seconds. So you kept nicely to time.
Good.
Where does the data, like when you work on a project, where does the data reside? Who has this data? And what happens once you locate the data? Maybe you can talk us through the sort of end-to-end process of a typical project you might be engaged in.
Yeah, very, very happy to talk through the end-to-end process, which really starts with the question.
Yeah.
So to us, it's really important, and I think it's good practice generally to sort of start with the hypothesis, start with what are we trying to answer or either confirm or refute. And then coming out of that is, okay, what's the data that we actually need to collect? Where does that data reside? And how can we make it the data control worth their while to actually facilitate access to the data? And we think that's quite different to what happens often in practice, where people say, well, hang on, this is the data I have. So now how can I shape that into what I'm trying to answer? We start at the other end. And the data will then typically reside in clinical sources like hospital environments, and that can be secondary, tertiary, sometimes even quaternary care settings. But really, really critical, we find, is that people are most interested in going beyond that. That's kind of the obvious source that people are reasonably used to. But what we push towards is then looking also at primary care data, because for some of the conditions that we've helped with, if you take, for example, gastroenterology, you take IBD conditions, the prescription in primary care domain around steroids, for instance, has a significant impact on the outcomes associated with much more expensive biologics, for example. So that's just one random example. But in other cases, we then also push, for instance, much deeper into diagnostic data. So a liver project that we've been working on for chronic liver disease, which is the only chronic condition that's had worsening outcomes over the last 40 years, by the way, and it's quite tragic. What we've been able to do is pull together some of the diagnostic data with some of the health record data to show in a much clearer way when the transplant window is open, and therefore we avoid the otherwise tragic consequences for health and system costs if that window is missed. So it's also about the diagnostics. What we are really excited about being able to do, though, is fold in patient-reported outcomes, some of the activity metrics that really, really matter for some of the conditions we're now looking at around mental health, for example, or looking at the effectiveness of oncology treatments where the fitness levels of people that are undergoing radiotherapy or chemotherapy, for example, really, really matter, right? So kind of the prehabilitation for that, where actually interfacing then with some of the biomarkers around activity metrics are important. So the simple answer, Sam, is a bit complicated, that it does depend on the condition, but really what we try to do is identify with our customers what are the critical data elements, where do we find them, clinical, non-clinical, doesn't matter, and then we bring those together in a longitudinal fashion, typically either retrospectively or prospectively.
No, that's a really helpful description, actually, Philip. It's pretty clear to me as to the use cases there. We have quite a strong bias towards technology-focused listeners on the Transformation in Trials podcast. Could you talk a bit more about some of the technology that Fitfile is using as it undertakes these projects and initiatives?
Sure. So we have seen quite a few privacy-enhancing techniques that have been used, I would argue, with varying success more recently. So I'm sure listeners will be familiar with homomorphic encryption, for example, where encrypted ciphertext is used and analyzed as if it's identifiable data. But that process is still reversible, and therefore personal data is technically identifiable. And it's also still very slow and expensive. So we've not really incorporated that into our solution. Similarly, confidential computing is something that's often talked about. And again, I believe for good reason, because if personal data in confidential computing is protected in CPU enclaves during the processing, that definitely helps protect against exposure to the rest of the system. But it doesn't solve, again, that conundrum around how to link records for underlying individuals without moving some data. And it's, by the way, the same thing with secure multi-party computing, which is great for keeping each party's input anonymized. But guess what? It doesn't really help with linking records. So none of these approaches, which are often talked about, by the way, when it comes to kind of how do we work with data at greater scale, how do we do it securely, solve that core problem of uniting data without sharing personally identifiable information. Now, what we've done at Fitfile is to bring together a novel combination of cryptographic techniques, which include, frankly, some public-private key infrastructure that's been around for 4 or 5 decades, together with techniques such as zero-knowledge proof, which have only really come to the fore in the last few years, to be able to do a few cool things that we don't think anybody else is currently able to do. First of all, in our process, we can establish either in a deterministic or probabilistic manner the overlap of populations across sources. So we can establish, across a hospital, primary care, maybe activity metrics, these are the 2,000 people that are common to those sources. What we can then do is we first anonymize irreversibly the data for those individuals in each source and still unite the anonymized records across sources. And that's not something that we believe anybody else is able to do. And we then follow that up with offering the absolute highest privacy protection by allowing computation at each source for those overlapping populations. So for use cases where actually it's deemed sufficient and safest to not move any record level data, I'm sure you can imagine within, let's say, source one, we talk about just the BMI for that population. So we can calculate statistical attributes for that. In the second source, maybe it's about HbA1c if we're talking about diabetes. And then in the third source, it's maybe about their typical activity levels. And we can do that for what we've already established are the same individuals and do those statistical computations. And in that way, we can actually drive truly federated analytics across sources to establish those complete health profiles for the populations, stratified however we want to, in order to then show, for example, for a product that's under research versus the current gold standard, and show that relative performance and safety, for instance, as well.
Amazing. I'm certainly impressed, and I would imagine a lot of the market out there are going to be pretty impressed too, which kind of leads me on to who would your typical customers be then? Obviously not mentioning names, but what type of customer groups would typically come to Fitfile for your technology and services?
We have a deliberately and not always easy to manage multi-stakeholder approach, because we would really like to help with the sort of largest possible use of the same underlying data access. So our customer groups are split into 2 to 3 key buckets. The first one is on the life science side, we are absolutely working with pharma companies of varying sizes, as well as contract research organizations. So we find that both those customer groups are very interested, and we are working on use cases like the feasibility and recruitment, outcomes tracking, and pushing into commercial positioning intelligence as well. The other key stakeholder group that we have as customers is the health systems themselves. So for us, it's really important to make sure that, particularly for the clinical sources, we are seen favorably by the people who are accumulating this clinical data. So they have their own planning and care needs, which we can help satisfy with our platform. But of course, we need access to that data anyway to be able to make it available to the life science side of things. So our business model is very much geared towards making both those sides happy. We have a third bucket, which is very sort of proactive in its interest for the Fitfile product, which is the payor side of things. And that's one where, of course, we are particularly sensitive to individuals' potential objections to sharing their data with insurance companies, for example. And so we're very, very careful on that. But of course, as you can imagine, actually the projects that we've already embarked on are very much in the interest of those individuals, because we're helping health plans, for example, better understand their member groups in anonymized fashion, so that they can tailor better product offerings and, frankly, also offer more competitive pricing and overcome what is often otherwise a problem around the actuarial estimates with insufficient information. So those are the 3 key groups that we serve.
It sounds like you're doing something pretty novel there, Philip. And what's the reaction from the market been like to what Fitfile are up to? Have you had to do a lot of evangelizing the market about data anonymization and why they should care about it? Or does the market really understand that and it's more about the technology and why you?
I think the market is increasingly focused on working with data in smarter and more scalable ways and trying to overcome the historical sensitivities. As horrible as the pandemic was, I think COVID has helped with lessening people's sensitivity to sharing data and increasing their appreciation, particularly of real world data. So that's been really useful. And what we are finding, particularly across Europe, is I think people are very open to embracing versions of what they're already used to, increasingly in the US, for instance, with tokenization, which doesn't work as well as we've discussed earlier in Europe, where the privacy constraints are a lot higher. So to be honest, it's been a mix because our solution is so innovative and has so much potential. we're having to connect it to what people are used to. So we do link it back to tokenization or pseudonymization. And of course, we offer that as part of our platform, because we can unite very easily identifiable or pseudonymized or tokenized data. And we're just trying to help everybody with the broadest available spectrum of privacy treatment and ultimately privacy preservation, and in that way, kind of push forward the safety and the scale of data usage for clinical research.
Very cool. I think I know my sales pitch, if I was selling it, be like, tokenization, it's like that, but better.
Yes, that's why one day we'll have you as an advisor or a member of the team.
So sophisticated.
Yeah.
Perfect.
It works for me.
Awesome. Look, this has been a great conversation, Philip. But as we start to draw the episode to a close, we always ask our listeners the same final question. And that question is, if you could wave a magic wand and change one thing about our industry, and that could be healthcare as a whole in this instance, or just clinical trials, what would that be and why?
So one thing that should finally change is the speed with which things are made to happen. And I'm sure we all appreciate and we understand that clinical trials are complex to organize, especially across greater numbers of jurisdictions and with an ever greater focus on precision treatments. And of course, it's important to ensure safety, right? But when it comes to embracing and rolling out new technologies and better ways of doing things, our sector is still way too slow. And if I may say, paying, in my opinion, a little too much lip service as well. And I say all this because, Deloitte's study just in January this year is the latest example of how a relatively fortunate sector is quite happy to accept what I think they highlighted as a 1.2% return on investment on pharma R&D. Okay, that's the lowest level in 13 years that they've been tracking this. And why is this happening? Because yet again, longer cycle times mean that the average cost of bringing a drug to market has now ballooned to $2.5 billion, something like that. And the average forecast peak sales have also decreased again to less than $400 million per drug. And to me, if actually we could properly, quickly use these latest generation data and privacy tech. Fitfile is only one example. There's so much cool stuff out there that can be championed by sponsors. So we can get better feasibility information to lead to more precise recruitment. We can get faster trials, longer patent protected revenue periods, frankly, benefiting patients who can get access to those treatments sooner. Or synthetic control arms, right, which can deliver more compelling evidence, or long-term follow-up is started earlier and with richer, more compelling evidence. All of that stuff has a real chance to turn these abysmal clinical trial performance stats around and really drive the sorely needed transformation in trials and beyond.
Perfect. Great answer, Philip. And I have a funny feeling that yourself and Fitfile are really going to be pushing the needle on this particular topic, and we're going to see lots more from both you and the company. So really appreciate having you on the show today. Where can our listeners reach out to you if they're keen to get in touch and learn more perhaps about some of the topics we've been discussing today? So we are always keen to work with more people to get all these fantastic technologies in use. Contact@fitfile.com is the easiest way. Our website is www.fitfile.com, and we'd love to hear from anybody. Always happy to talk, basically 24/7. Thanks for a great episode, Philip. Bye-bye. Thank you.
You're listening to Transformation in Trials. If you have a suggestion for a guest for our show, reach out to Sam Parnell or Ivana Rosendahl on LinkedIn. You can find more episodes on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, or in any other player. Remember to subscribe and get the episodes hot off the editor.